Okay, so let me just quickly introduce Alexander. He is the director of the Petrarch Institute. He has a bachelor's degree from Princeton University, PhD from the Catholic University in Leuven. He's taught in a variety of places and is a lecturer currently at Johns Hopkins University
I was.
on a special arrangement whereby he's allowed to live in Spain while doing that. He's written several books. Like one of them is called The Crown Under Law. The second one is called The Theoretic Life, A Classical Ideal, and Its Modern Fate. And I don't know if the third book has come out yet, which you co-authored with Graham McAleer, The Wisdom of Our Ancestors, Conservative Humanism and the Western Tradition. And I just want to add that I read one of his essays on the internet in which he discussed the role of Christianity in maintaining Western civilization and contributing to Western civilization. This is a very important theme, and I think one that hasn't gotten nearly the attention that it deserves. And so I thank you and I applaud you for starting work in this direction, Alexander. And I understand that today you'll be speaking on a different topic. So um, please, Alexander, take it away.
Yeah, just to say a couple of things. One is my voice is a little hoarse today, and also, like I said, I'm not currently teaching at Johns Hopkins, but I was teaching there for 16
Oh,
years.
okay.
Okay, so why don't we just make sure, so share. Okay, so can everybody see the PowerPoint?
Yes, thank you.
Excellent.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so anti-colonialism as an ideology. So the topic will be anti-colonialism as an ideology, the nexus of anti-Westernism and anti-Zionism. So my plan is basically, I basically divided the PowerPoint into three parts. The first is to show the connections between anti-Zionism and a more general anti-Westernism as manifestations of ideology. And we'll try to flesh out a little bit what that means, right? The second is we'll dive into the roots of anti-colonial ideology, looking at key ideas and thinkers. And in the third part, I will try to address some of the claims of anti-colonialism in terms of overlooking some of the historical complexities that I think are there in the sort of simplified and I would say ideological vision of the issues of Israel and the West more broadly. Well, so just a couple of citations. This expresses Augustine's tragic vision of history that the world is ruled by the lust to rule. So that'll be sort of a theme, as one can imagine. And I thought also, because I believe we're in a battle in some sense in academia for how to understand and interpret the Western inheritance. So I thought Orwell's warning that who controls the past controls the future, and who controls the present controls the past was a salient warning to keep in mind. Well, first, let's just look at the brute facts of the situation. So, I mean, already in 2019, Fadi Hamad, Hamas bureau member, said we must attack every Jew on planet Earth and slaughter and kill them. And on October the 7th, I'm sure you all basically know what occurred, the largest mass murder of Jews since the Nazi Holocaust. Roughly 1,200 people were killed, men, women, children, infants. There were widespread reports from witnesses and forensic evidence about gang rape, torture, mutilation. About 250 Israelis are taken hostage, including Shiri Bibas with her infant and 4-year-old, who's become well known, I think, in Israel and throughout much of the world. Hamas's statement after the attacks was by Ghazi Hamad, the spokesman. He said that Israel has to be destroyed effectively. And he said that the attacks would be repeated over and over again until the objective of destroying Israel was accomplished. I think the more shocking, perhaps, dimension is some of the rhetoric that occurred in the West, right? Because not much can be expected of Hamas in this regard. And not in sort of backwoods areas, but right in the heart of elite academia and other aspects of the Western intelligentsia. So at Harvard University, over 30 student organizations issued a statement in less than 24 hours, said, "We, the undersigned student organizations, hold the Israeli regime entirely responsible for all unfolding violence. Coming days will require a firm stand against colonial retaliation." At Stanford University, a lecturer actually separated Jewish students in the classroom, saying that they were being treated the way the Israelis treat the Palestinians. This is one of the most shocking elements given the Hamas's treatment of the Israeli women. The feminist press said, "We define our feminism as anti-racist, anti-capitalist, anti-imperial, and decolonial. And we intend to make that explicit with not only our work, but also our practices of solidarity. In 2023 and beyond, we particularly hope to collaborate with and center Palestinian authors in light of the ongoing genocide in Gaza." In the literary journal Guernica, somebody wrote, Joanna Chen, I think was her name, wrote a piece expressing sympathy for both sides, both the Palestinian suffering as well as the Israelis. And one of the editors called it a rank piece of genocide apologia, a pillar of eugenicist white colonialism masquerading as goodness. She resigned. The piece was disavowed by the editors and so forth. So this gives some indication, I think, of where a good part of the intelligentsia is. I'll refer to Eric Voegelin later as well, but I think this illustrates our first indication of what I'd call an ideological manifestation, namely his idea of second reality, right? That ideology functions. He was one of the important political philosophers who discussed what modern ideologies are about. And one aspect is he talks about ideologies function as second realities. So in this case, I thought it was an example of this. Hamas is involved in massacre, rape, and torture of Jews, which is the reality of what happened, but then it's sort of envisioned through the prism of the anti-colonial ideology. Which is about oppressors and oppressed. And then we have a second reality that actually conceals the first reality. So this is something that Eric Voegelin talked about. Now, one of the aspects of this is the substantial ideological as well as generational divide in the United States, right? So you see that from the 2022 poll, before all this broke out, Republicans are much more strongly pro-Israel than Democrats, right? Where the anti-colonial ideology, presumably as an ideology of the left, would be more ensconced. But I think the most telling thing is actually the generational divide. So you see that in the group 18 to 29, which would be the college-educated people going through school sort of recently, is the only generational cohort which is majority anti-Israel. So I think that that's somewhat revealing about the direction of education, particularly, and what kind of ideas are being inculcated by academia to a large degree at this point. So one of the things that I think is peculiar about what's happening right now in terms of what we can call the anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism, two concepts are kind of similar, Zionism being focused on Israel. Historically, anti-Semitism tended to be xenophobic, right? Hatred, exaltation of one's own culture, and hatred of the outsider, right? So The Nazis would be a classic example of that, right? Exalting the Germans, right? And then hatred toward the outsider, or the foreigner, in which they included Jews, right? But what's happening nowadays is oikophobic anti-Semitism, or oikophobic anti-Zionism, where the problem is not that the Jews are perceived as outsiders, but that they're perceived as white Europeans, right, who have conquered someone else's land, right? So it's rooted in a kind of hatred, oikophobia, meaning denigration of one's own culture and exaltation of the foreign culture, which I think probably helps to account why the phenomena has moved from the far right to the far left, right? Because oikophobia is more of a tendency, I would say, on the left, and xenophobia on the extreme. We're talking about the extremes, on the extreme right and the extreme left. The concept of oikophobia came from the concept of the ideas of Roger Scruton, who was an important British conservative intellectual. He coined the term, of course, from the Greek, as all you classicists know, from oikos, the hatred of one's own, right, which he thinks is the new malady sweeping the West. And going along with that is what he calls a culture of repudiation, right? So we have this tendency to have to demonstrate our separation from our ancestors by repudiating their inheritance, right? And so we have in the West, and I think we've seen especially in the United States in recent years, this culture of repudiation, which is also, I think, part of the academic situation. So this would be an example. Steve Balch did a study, who's a friend of mine also, in addition, but he headed up the National Association of Scholars. He did a survey of the vanishing of the Western Civilization survey course, and noted it virtually disappeared. Stanford University tried to reinstate a Western civilization course, and got a lot of pushback. And this was one of the comments from student: a Western civ requirement would necessitate that our education be centered on upholding white supremacy, capitalism, and colonialism, and other oppressive systems that flow from Western civilizations. So that, I think, indicates this idea of the Western inheritance as a kind of burden of sin that one has to lift off of one's shoulder, often through acts of repudiation of the past. Anti-colonialism has targeted the university, right? There was a text called Decolonizing the University. But this is an idea that is spreading through many universities. The basic idea is that the traditional canon of Western texts that has communicated the Western civilizational inheritance through the centuries is not a neutral canon, but is the expression of the privileged European male, essentially. It's the expression of a power structure that needs to be challenged and overthrown, right? So I think probably many of you are familiar with aspects of this idea of decolonizing the university, decolonizing the curriculum. Now I just want to make some general remarks about ideology, right? What is an ideology? Because we might just think of an ideology as a set of ideas about politics, for example, or a set of doctrines about any old subject. But a number of political philosophers and political scientists view ideology as a kind of modern phenomena that has certain specific traits. And so I want to look briefly at a couple of theories about ideology, generally speaking. So one is the oppressor-oppressed binary, right? This simple division into oppressors and oppressed that you can find, for example, in the Communist Manifesto, right? Bourgeois and proletariat, but we can fill in the blanks, right? Male and female, white colonialists versus indigenous people of color, and so forth. A second and very important aspect that gives the ideology a lot of power is this idea, which also has a Marxist provenance, of false consciousness, right? In Kenneth Minogue's understanding. So what does that mean? We are part of oppressive systems we might not even be aware of, right? So the oppressed collective class might not be aware that they're oppressed, and the oppressor might not be aware that they're oppressing. And so what the ideology does is try to unmask, right? This is the claim, the pretense of the ideology is unmask the false consciousness in order to liberate the oppressor from the situation of oppression. A third is insulation from falsifiability. So, for example, if you challenge the ideology, you're considered complicit in the system of oppression. So this would be a frequent feature of ideological thinking, ideological systems. And last would be utopianism, right? The belief that you can create a society free of social injustice, oppression, inequality, and so forth, right? A sort of a kingdom of God on earth, right? Which is actually important to Voegelin's theory. So for Voegelin, right? So the question is, how did modern ideologies arise? And he has many interesting thoughts. We can't go into this too deeply, but this concept of immanentizing the eschaton became kind of a meme for a while. Basically, the idea is, so the modern ideologies are almost uniformly present themselves as militantly secular and anti-Christian, right? But nonetheless, a number of important thinkers have understood modern ideology as emerging from a secularization of Christian eschatology, right? So, for example, the idea that the last shall be first, right? Those who are last in this world will be first in the next, that type of idea, and the idea of a millennium. And in fact, there's been good historical studies of this. I would recommend Norman Cohn's book, Pursuit of the Millennium, how in the transition from the medieval to the modern world, all these millenarian sects started to arise that believed in a kingdom of God on earth in which the primordial condition of justice and equality that prevailed in Eden, essentially, would be restored by the coming of Jesus Christ to earth in a literal rule of 1,000 years. They invade against private property and any form of social hierarchy and led a lot of revolutionary movements. So one of the theories about how ideologies arose was as a secularization of the millenarian temptation. So the basic idea is that the world is sort of radically evil, basic millenarian idea, the world's sort of radically evil under conditions of oppression, but that there would be an apocalyptic event that would reverse it and restore history to sort of a year zero. And this is sort of what we see in Bolshevism, in the French Revolution and so forth, this idea of throwing off the past, the evil world, and sort of starting history anew. So often what you will see in ideological systems is rituals of repudiation, such as iconoclasm. So, for example, during the de-Christianization of France, during the French Revolution, they went around smashing the statues of saints. They abolished the Christian calendar. So instead of 1792, it becomes year one of the revolution. So it's of this idea of resetting time. Also in China, during the Cultural Revolution, there was a similar idea. So Confucianism, the tomb of Confucius was actually attacked by the Red Guards, and images of Confucius were vandalized and mocked, right? So in addition to the fact that they were killing actual people in large numbers, lots of priests and nuns were killed in the French Revolution, millions of dissidents were killed in the Chinese Cultural Revolution, they were also trying to abolish the past and sort of restart time. So it's notable that in 2020, we saw manifestations of iconoclasm in the United States, right? Attacks on all the statues of the hitherto revered figures, Christopher Columbus, St. Juniper Serra, important Spanish missionary, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Ulysses Grant, Winston Churchill. There were attacks on churches and synagogues, attacks on war memorials, right? So there was a sort of massive campaign across dozens of cities. And it spread to some degree to the UK, and there were some incidents in continental Europe as well. So I think that type of iconoclasm within the anti-colonial movements is something relevant. So now I'll transition to part two, if that's good for everyone. Hope that was clear. So now we'll look at anti-colonialism, key ideas, and thinkers. So first we should say, just to set the stage in terms of the age of Europe. That's a phrase often used by Cornel West, right, from 1492 to 1945, right? So this is obviously the civilization forged by the inheritance of Greece, Rome, and Christianity had been largely a local Mediterranean or European civilization, but it, from beginning with Columbus, it embarks on global expansion, right? And there's all kinds of tumult in these centuries, obviously, the Reformation, the Counter-Reformation, the Enlightenment waves of revolution and counter-revolution. But Europe is also, within this period, asserted its dominance over every other world civilization. Now, obviously, empire is nothing new. It goes back before Sargon of Akkad, right? There have been empires and efforts to conquer. But what is new is the global impact of European colonialism, which occurred basically, we could say, in two waves, right? So the Spanish Empire was very dominant in the first wave. And then in the second wave, in the 19th and early 20th centuries to some degree, right, particularly Britain and France took control of large swaths of Africa and Asia. And just to mention some of the impacts, obviously, the impacts are enormous, right? Technological, right? So the spread of European science, modes of production, communication, transport, weaponry, medicine. Economics, right? The world was more or less disconnected. The Aztecs didn't know anything about the Chinese and so forth, right? But the process of colonialism connected economically. Demographics, so you have large-scale movements of peoples, right? So European settlers create new countries like the United States, Canada, Australia, and so forth. The transatlantic slave trade brought millions of Africans, and the impacts of the arrival of Europeans caused demographic collapses in the New World civilizations. Religious, right? So Christianity, Spain, for example, sent about 20,000 missionaries funded by the Spanish government to bring Christianity to the New World, but there were also missionaries almost always followed colonial ventures, and Christianity emerged as the largest world religion. Political and social, right? In many places, European settlers established dominance over and subordinated non-Europeans. European political doctrines like democracy, liberalism, nationalism, socialism, communism, fascism, right? All ideas that have European provenance spread throughout the world, and European ideas of international law and human rights have also obtained wide extension, and linguistic, right? English, Spanish, French, and so forth also spread, obviously. This era came to an end with the two world wars, where Europe essentially imploded, not least as a result of ideological frenzies, fascism, communism, Nazism, and so forth. And Europe was left a devastated continent, very weak. So it's in that period that decolonization, when a weakened Europe was under challenge from anti-colonial movements, that you get the development of anti-colonial theorists. So just to look at, we'll start with Frantz Fanon, right, who's still very widely taught today. So just brief things about his biography. He's born in Martinique in the French Caribbean. He fights with the Free French in World War II. His interests were in psychology and psychiatry. So in his works, you'll see a lot of interest in, for example, the impacts of racism and colonial subjugation on the psychology of the colonized. Lived experience, right, which comes from a phenomenological and existentialist setting. He was friends, by the way, with Jean-Paul Sartre. So there's a sort of existentialist aspect. So I'd say there's two major books. The first was Black Skin, White Masks, right, which deals with the damaging psychological impacts of internalized racism. He would later move to Algeria, and he became active in the FLN to oust the French from Algeria. And he wrote The Wretched of the Earth, which is the text I'll primarily be talking about. And he died in 1961 of leukemia. Well, I don't know, should I get into Hegel? Probably not too much, but there's a Hegelian background to Fanon's thoughts, which is this idea of the master-slave dialectic. So in brief, it's the idea that basically the master establishes dominance over the slave because the slave values life more than freedom at the beginning, and the slave's not fully conscious of his or her humanity. The master gets a kind of recognition of his humanity from the slave, but an imperfect one, since the slave is not considered really competent to bestow that recognition. This idea of recognition is very central in Hegel. But the basic idea is that over time and through the process of labor and so forth, the slave eventually acquires consciousness of his or her humanity and then fights to secure recognition. And so I think you'll see that dynamic very much playing out. This, by the way, is the Spanish soldiery and Berbers in Morocco. There was an important anti-colonial rebellion in the Rif. So basically what Fanon says is that there's a colonizer-colonized relationship, which functions very much like, we're like plugging in the variables of the master-slave dynamic, right? It's Manichaean, right? There's two sides absolutely distinct and apart, right? The colonizer and the colonist, which is created by the circumstance of colonialism. And the colonizer's ultimate aim is to displace, destroy, and displace the indigenous culture. So religion functions as one of the tools, right? The Christianization of the colonized people sort of Europeanizes them in some sense, right? So that's one aspect. The other is education, right? And this is probably why anti-colonial ideologues of today are so interested in taking control of educational systems, because Fanon thinks that education is a vehicle that induces the inferiority complex in the colonized, right? Basically, the colonials are taught to, as he puts it, guarding the Greco-Roman pedestal, right? That the Greek and Roman origins of European civilization represent the pinnacle of human accomplishment and achievement. And when the colonized are taught to worship this, what they want ultimately is to become like the colonizer. They internalize their own sense of the inferiority of their own native culture. But ultimately, if those don't work, the ultimate recourse is violence, right? So he depicts the colonial system as fundamentally one of violence. These are French soldiers in Algeria. The brute force of the colonizer, right? So there's a basic violence in the system. This violence of the colonial system creates fear and repressed rage in the colonized subject, right? So on the one hand, the colonized subject feels an inferiority to the European because of how they've been educated. But on the other hand, they're also enraged, right? And as a psychiatrist, Fanon believed that a lot of the psychological problems that he was dealing with were coming from the fundamental colonial situation. So what he argues is that violence is an important psychological catharsis. Quite apart from the efficacy, right? Will the FLN oust the French or not? just the act of violence, as he puts it, rids the colonized of their inferiority complex, of their passive and despairing attitude. It emboldens them and restores the self-confidence. This is a scene from the Battle of Algiers, a very famous film by Gillo Pontecorvo, which I recommend, by the way. It's very well made. Where the FLN, the Algerian liberation movement, starts targeting the European civilian population and blowing up cafes and crowds and so forth. And he says, to blow the colonial world to smithereens is henceforth a clear image within the grasp and imagination of every colonized subject. To destroy the colonial world, so he says that to dislocate the colonial world does not mean that once the borders have been eliminated, there will be a right of way between two sectors, like there's just going to be harmony, right? To destroy the colonial world means nothing less than demolishing the colonist sector, burying it deep within the earth, or banishing it from the territory, right? So I think when you hear things like, like there was a internet meme after the Hamas attacks, what did you think decolonization meant, and that sort of thing. I think perhaps some of Fanon's ideas about the liberating catharsis of violence by the colonized against their colonizer lurks in the background of this thought. And he ends the work with kind of a manifesto, right? Let us leave this Europe, which never starts talking about man, yet massacres him at every one of its street corners. The European game is finally over. And he talks about creating a new man, which is, I think, something you find in a lot of ideologies, right? The idea of creating a new humanity. So one of the things he rejected, parenthetically, was the idea of returning to a pre-colonial condition, right? Returning to a native pre-colonial culture. He said the third world needs to chart new courses. Not exactly a fellow traveler, but not exactly an anti-colonial theorist, Herbert Marcuse, in sort of the German neo-Marxist critical theory wing, nonetheless has ideas that I think we see a lot of salience in today, right? So basically what he says is that liberalism grants the same tolerance to the right as to the left, right? He sees as movements of aggression as well as to movements of peace, right? And in doing so, it actually protects the already established machinery of discrimination, right? So by tolerating the ideas of the conservatives of the right, you're actually defending the oppressive system. So he distinguishes between repressive tolerance, which is tolerating the right and left equally, and liberating tolerance, which he says would mean intolerance against movements from the right and toleration of movements from the left, right? So liberating tolerance is that the left gets full play and the right is suppressed, as against liberalism's pretense of neutrality, that we're just going to take a neutral view and allow every view to be expressed as though they're all on the same plane. Hope that's clear. Well, I'm not enthusiastic about delving into Derrida, but there's one idea that I think has salience in this debate in the French post-structuralist and postmodernist thinking, right? So in his work, White Mythology, Derrida said, what is metaphysics? A white mythology which assembles and reflects Western culture. The white man takes his own mythology, that is Indo-European mythology, his logos, that is the mythos of his idiom, for the universal form of that which is his inescapable desire to call reason. Where do I see sort of, legacies of this idea, salient aspects? Well, this idea that rationality is Western, that there's a Western rationality, which is somehow different from anyone else's rationality, is an idea that has been circulating, right? That and so the question I would ask is, does this fit into Minogue's idea that ideologies try to insulate themselves from critique? Oh, you're using your Western reason, rationalism, to try to critique my position, right, or whatever it is. So So that's, I think, an instrumental use. But maybe more important, Foucault emphasized the relationship between truth and power. Truth, I would put in quotation marks, right? Truth isn't outside power or lacking in power. Each society has its regime of truth, its general politics of truth. That is the types of discourse which it accepts and makes function as true. So this basic idea that knowledge is the expression of power relations, right? So for example, the idea that knowledge might be the expression, let's say, of a Eurocentric power structure that wants to maintain its position would be something that might follow. So there's a kind of relativism that I think comes from Foucault's Nietzscheanism, together with this idea that knowledge is a production, right? There is no objective knowledge, right? Which, well, I mean, I see it a lot in our time of disregarding facts, the facts of the situation, right? In favor of unmasking, this idea of unmasking what the underlying power structure is, right, behind knowledge claims. And that's going to be relevant to Edward Said, who I think helps establish the link between the sort of generic anti-colonialism, anti-Westernism, and the specific issues of Zionism and Israel, right? So he's born in Jerusalem in British Palestine, moves to Cairo with his family and attends an English language school, moves to the US, completes his PhD in Harvard, and he becomes a professor of literature. Probably his most famous text is Orientalism, which we'll discuss briefly in a moment. But I think for our purposes, his work Zionism from the standpoint of its victims is going to be where he tries to establish the link between European colonialism and Israel, is the most important element from our standpoint. Edward Said in Orientalism explicitly appeals to Foucault's notion of discourse, right, as about power relations, right? So he says Orientalism is a Western style for dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient. So the basic idea, we could say, is that the literary, intellectual, and scholarly Orientalism, that is to say, scholars of the Middle East, European, and particularly focuses on the French and the British, we're not neutral scholarship, right? Looking for the truth, but we're actually disciplines by which the colonial powers represented the Orient in a certain way in order to make it ripe for colonization. So I think we could see that sort of application of Foucault's idea of knowledge and power, knowledge as being a construction of power. Orientalism is a kind of application of that to the relations between Europeans and the Islamic Middle East in particular. So in Zionism, from the standpoint of its victims and other works, he wants to show how Europe had an ideology of dispossession, in which the land, any claims to their own land by the colonized did not need to be taken into account. And the examples I chose, the Congress of Berlin, where the European powers decided how they were going to carve up Africa, or American settlers in the New World. In neither case were, the idea would be, in neither case were the claims of the indigenous peoples of what became the United States or what became, or Africa, in neither case were they taken seriously. And the basic idea that Said says is that a civilized man could cultivate the land because it meant something. For an uncivilized people, land was either farmed badly or it was left to rot, right? From this string of ideas by which whole native societies who lived on American, African, and Asian territories for centuries were suddenly denied their right to live on that land, right? From that came the great dispossessing movements of modern European imperialism, right? And the subjection of the Americas, Africa, and Asia to European powers. Said also mentions racism. This is Count Gobineau, who's considered one of the fathers of modern racism. The idea of the superiority of the white race as part how it was used in imperial ideologies to subjugate. So now what is the link to Zionism? That, by the way, is Arthur Balfour, whose portrait was recently vandalized in Cambridge University with Winston Churchill, and there's General Allenby entering Jerusalem. So what he says is that the Zionists, in spite of the reality of European anti-Semitism, which he accepts as being a reality, that Zionism did not take seriously, just like the European imperialists generally, any type of claims that the native indigenous Arab populations had. And he says Zionism essentially saw Palestine, as the European imperialists did, as an empty territory paradoxically filled with ignoble or perhaps even dispensable natives. There's Balfour with Chaim Weissman. And he says that Zionism not only accepted the generic racial concepts of European culture, it also banked on the fact that Palestine was actually peopled not by an advanced, but by a backward people over which it ought to be dominant, right? So essentially, Zionism, in spite of the peculiar position of Jews within European societies themselves, nonetheless absorbed the fundamental European imperialist view of the non-European and disregarded the impact on Palestinian Arabs, right? The natives would remain in their non-place, Jews in theirs, and so forth. It's no wonder that today the one issue that electrifies Israel as a society is the problem of the Palestinians, whose negation is the most consistent thread running through Zionism. So that I think covers some of what I think of as the broad ideas of the anti-colonial ideology, as well as how particularly Said, right, connects colonialism to Zionism. And now in the last and final part, I just want to raise some challenges, or at least complexify the historical narrative of anti-colonialism. So these are just some questions and challenges I'm going to raise. Entangled Destinies, a historical excursus on the Jews, the West, and Israel. Okay, so 4 basic questions that I'm going to cover, right? So one is, right, so we hear all the time that the Palestinians are indigenous and the Israelis are European settlers, right? We're settler colonialists, right? So should the Jewish people be considered a Western people or an indigenous Middle Eastern people? Actually, I think it's more complicated than either of those binaries, but we'll deal with that in a moment. Was Zionism implicated in the project of European imperialism? Third, should the evils associated with modern European empires be judged by ideal moral standards or in comparison to actually existing other historical empires? In other words, do we look at European empires in relation to ideal standards of morality, or do we judge them against the historical record of other empires throughout history? In other words, are the European empires an exception, uniquely malevolent, or something like that, right? And that's really the last question, right? Were the impacts of European colonialism uniquely or exclusively negative? So those are the 4 questions that I'm going to try to deal very briefly. I had a much long, you can imagine all these topics are gigantic. So I had a lot more slides, but I'm just going to keep it short, try to keep it short. Okay. So what exactly is the West is debatable. I take my cue from Herodotus, right? So Herodotus in the histories speaks about Europe and Asia, the distinction between Europe and Asia. And I think we can more or less understand the West as Europe, and well, the East as Asia, with a proviso that after the age of Europe, you had the expansion of European civilization to other parts of the world, like the United States, Canada, Australia, Argentina, and so forth, which are not geographically located. But I think that that's a useful template. Obviously, these are human conventions to some degree, but I think we can take that as a template. So, judging by that standard, ancient Israel was not part of the West, right? Not part of Europe. It was an indigenous civilization to the Middle East. Our oldest record, physical record, mentioning Israel's the Merneptah stele, as far as I know, which goes back to 1208. So we're talking about over 3,000 years of Jewish inhabitation in Israel. That's the Ketef Hinnom scroll, which is the earliest attested physical biblical text. I did a search for what's the earliest, we could say, European or Western reference to Jews. Werner Jaeger, the German classicist, has a good article on it. I could give the reference if anyone's interested. But one of the oldest that I found was Theophrastus, who was the disciple of Aristotle in the Hellenistic era after Alexander the Great, where he talks about the Jews as a nation of philosophers, which I think from Theophrastus would be complementary. Of course, not all the Hellenic Jewish interactions were as amicable as we know, but well, that's very far into Jewish history, right? I mean, he's 3rd century BC, right? Late. So I think, what does he die in 271 or something like that? I don't remember off the top of my head, but at all events, it's quite late for the first interaction. But it's not as simple to say the Jews, I think, are simply non-Western because of the vast influence of Jews and Judaism on European civilization, right? So there are records of Jewish communities in Rome before the Jewish revolts and so forth, but you have the big diaspora after the Jewish revolts against Rome. Under Hadrian, Jews are banned, and the province is renamed Syria Palestina, right, from the Philistines, where the term Palestine comes from. So you now have significant Jewish communities living in Europe. And we know from genetic studies, there was also some level of mixture between the Middle Eastern, Ashkenazim, for example, seem to have both European and Middle Eastern antecedents. But the position of Jews within Europe was, for most of the history, a quite marginal one, right? Ghettoization, discrimination, persecutions. But nonetheless, two big influences, obviously, of the Jews on European civilization, one more indirect, one direct. So with Christianity, you have a group that begins, all the first Christians were Jews ethnically, but it becomes enculturated as the primary religious tradition of the Greco-Roman world after Constantine. And so the Christian belief in the incarnation of Jesus Christ places a Jew really at the axis of world history, and the Bible becomes an all-embracing influence, right? So that, for example, Pope Benedict spoke really of the biblical faith and the Greco-Roman world as sort of two co-ancestors of European civilization. And secondly, particularly after emancipation, the influence of many individual Jews on Europe has been immense. We need not go through all the details, but just the names of Einstein and Freud, among others. So it's a little bit complicated, but the idea that Jews have no connection to Israel, I think we can we can dismiss out of hand, right? Which makes the situation a little different, even if we accept everything else about the anti-colonial ideology. The idea of Jews as simply European settlers is a complicated one. Okay, was Zionism implicated in the project of European imperialism? So, in my opinion, right, Zionism is better understood if we're going to link it to movements going on in Europe at the time, nationalism, right? So, at that time, there were general movements among, say, Hungarians, Italians, Germans, Slavic groups that emphasized the connection between a people, its land, and its language, right? And the Enlightenment solution to the situation of Jews in Europe, right, after the French Revolution and so forth, was to simply make of Jews basically French, British, German, of a particular faith group, and basically assimilate the Jewish people as European citizens, right? But with the outbreak of the Dreyfus affair in France, right, Herzl, who was a journalist at the time, started to get the sense that this wasn't going to work, right? So we can think of Zionism as a nationalist response, partly to the milieu, partly to the specific problem of European anti-Semitism. It's recalcitrance, having survived into modernity very, very clearly. Now, it is true, of course, that the Zionists worked with the power structure at times, right? So the Balfour Declaration of 1917, which was accepted at the San Remo conference, meaning the European powers accepted the idea of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, was part of the history. But at other times, when the British Empire withdrew its support largely from Zionism after the Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939, the Zionism and the imperialists were often at loggerheads. So this, I think, illustrates the two extremes of British colonial Zionist collaboration and confrontation, right? So the Balfour Declaration, right, which expressed British favoritism toward a Jewish homeland in Palestine. But then here is Irgun issuing a warning that if the British flog Jews in Palestine, which they call the occupation government, that the British officers are going to be whipped by Irgun in the same way. So here, the Zionists understand themselves as an indigenous national liberation movement in some sense, right? Almost more cognate with liberation movements of different kinds. Okay, now the other question is, now this is, here I'm going to give the ultimate tu quoque. But one of the questions would be, granted that there's all kinds of evils involved in Europe in the 4 centuries of European colonialism, cultural arrogance, injustice, enslavement, and outright atrocities at times, right? Massacres and so forth. Are these things unique failings of the West, right? Is the West uniquely guilty of the cruelties of imperial conquest? So a few examples. The Dzungar genocide in China during the Qianlong emperor in the 18th century, I believe, ordered the complete annihilation of the Dzungar Turkic people. Very few survived. So it was a genocide carried out by the Chinese Empire. The Mongol Empire, the lowest estimates that I found for deaths during the Mongol conquest was 11.5 million. So large-scale massacres of millions of people occurring under the Mongol Empire. You'll find a large equestrian statue of Genghis Khan in Mongolia today, which, as far as I know, has not yet to be vandalized or torn down. The genocide of Armenian Christians under the Ottoman Turkish Empire. We could talk about the massacres in Bulgaria by the Turks in 1878, I believe. And the Aztec Empire before the Spanish arrival. The Aztec Empire was heavily involved in human sacrifice. One historian, John Julius Norwich, estimates that when the great temple of the Aztecs was consecrated, 80,000 human beings were sacrificed. I don't know if there's scientific evidence, but there's been a lot of archaeological discoveries of the racks of skulls that the Spanish conquistadors and so forth spoke of. So that's one issue, right? What do we judge the record of the West against, right? And then the other thing is, well, oh yes, that's another point worth making, is how did Islam and Arabic come to the Levant? Well, it was through imperial conquest, essentially. So I think that's kind of a relevant point when we start talking about imperialism, colonialism, settlement, and so forth, those kinds of issues. Then the other question, and this may be my most controversial point, but I'm going to make it anyway, were the impacts of European colonialism uniquely or exclusively negative? So there's a few figures here that we can mention. Bartolomé de las Casas was a tireless worker for the rights of the indigenous peoples under the Spanish Empire, who lobbied the King of Spain, who in 1542 issued the new laws forbidding the enslavement of indigenous Americans, thanks to his lobbying, which he did in an official capacity as a Dominican friar within the Spanish Empire. Another figure, Francisco Vitoria, laid down a lot of the theoretical basis for the idea of human rights and the idea that the indigenous American peoples conquered by Spain had inherent rights as human beings, that all human beings have those rights, and therefore they could not be deprived of them, right? So there's a lot of interesting history there. William Wilberforce of Britain was a devout evangelical Christian who lobbied for the end of slavery. I don't know of any other empires before the Europeans who actually went around abolishing slavery wherever they went. In 1807, the British Empire abolished the slave trade. In 1833, slavery was abolished throughout the British Empire, and it was followed in the course of the 19th century by all of the other European empires. And then, of course, Winston Churchill, who used the resources and might of the British Empire to resist as part of ultimately the alliance, but for a long time standing alone against the victory of the Nazi regime in Europe. So, okay, so that's it. I have nothing more to say.